Tech billionaire named Diane Whitlock bet me her brand new Tesla Roadster that I couldn't get her late husband's 1967 Mustang running again after the specialty restoration shop she'd paid 40 grand had handed it back with a note that basically said the car was beyond saving. She made that bet leaning against my workbench in a barn that still smells like my father's pipe tobacco 20 years after he passed, and she made it in front of my son, who was sitting on an overturned milk crate, doing his algebra homework and watching this woman in a $1,000 coat look at the both of us like we were something the cat had dragged in off the gravel. I won the car back to running with a part that cost $4.11 at the Napa on Route 9. But I'm going to tell you something straight off, the way my dad would have told it. That $4 part is not the thing about this story that matters, not even close. What matters is what fixing that old Mustang ended up doing for my boy, and what it ended up doing months down the road to the hardest, most locked up, most armored over woman I have ever met in 51 years of meeting people. My name's Wesley Cooper. Folks who know me just call me Coop. I'm 51 years old and I rebuild engines and bodywork out of a barn on the back 2 acres of a property in a little nowhere town in central Pennsylvania. The kind of town with one stoplight and a diner that's been losing money on purpose since 1985 because the owner can't bring himself to close it. I work on cars that other people have given up on. Always have. That's sort of my whole thing if a man like me can be said to have a thing, and the day the title to a brand new electric supercar got signed over into my name was the day my whole life cracked open down the middle, but not for the reason you're already guessing, sitting there. And not in a way that anybody standing in my barn that afternoon could have called. Before I get into the bet, and the $4 part and the thing that woman did at the very end, that I still can't get all the way through without my voice doing something embarrassing, do me one favor. If you've ever had somebody look right through you because of the dirt under your nails, or the truck you drive, or the size of the town you come from, go ahead and tap subscribe right now. This channel is for the people who get talked over, who get talked down to, who get handed the bill and never the respect. I'll wait right here. Go on. Alright, then let me tell you how the whole thing really got started, which, same as just about everything worth telling in my life, starts with my kid. My son's name is Caleb, he's 11, and he is the single reason I bother getting up before the sun the way I do. And I have to tell you one hard thing about Caleb right up front, because if I don't, none of the rest of this lands the way it actually landed on me. Caleb's deaf, profoundly both ears, since he was a baby. Now I want to be careful how I say this part, because I have learned the hard way that hearing people get a certain look on their faces when I tell them, a kind of preloaded, sorry, and that look has never once in 11 years done my son a lick of good. Caleb is not a tragedy. Caleb is the funniest, sharpest, most stubborn human being I have ever shared a roof with. He signs circles around me. He reads lips so fast it's spooky. He has opinions about everything, and he is usually right, which is a maddening quality in a child and an excellent one in a grown man, so I figure he'll grow into it fine. But here's the thing that had been sitting on my chest like a cinder block for the better part of a year. There's a surgery, a cochlear implant, the second one for his other ear, the one we never could afford to do when he was little. The doctors up in Hershey told me there's a real window for it, and that window was closing, and the way they explained it, doing it now would change the whole shape of his life. School, friends, the whole world opening up a little wider for him, and the number they put on it after what our insurance was willing to cough up, which was about as much as you'd expect, was the kind of number that makes the floor tilt under your boots while you stand there nodding like you've got any idea where that money's coming from. And I'll back all the way up and tell you the hardest piece of it, because it's the part that explains everything about why I am the way I am. Caleb's mother left when he was 3. And I'm not going to sit here and drag her name through the mud, because my boy is going to be old enough one day to go looking for this, and I will not have him find his father running his mother down on the internet for strangers to chew on. So I'll tell it as gentle as I'm able. When Caleb was diagnosed, when the real long weight of it came down on us, the appointments, the therapies, the specialists 3 hours away, the bone-deep tired that never quite lifts, she found she couldn't carry it. Some people, it turns out, aren't built for the long haul. They're built for the easy stretch of road, and the second it turns to washboard and mud, they pull over, and they're gone. I have made my peace with it. Mostly. The kind of peace you make with the thing, which is to say I've stopped being angry about it on most days. and the other days I just keep my mouth shut and weld something. So it's been Caleb and me. 8 years now, me and a deaf 11-year-old who can take apart a carburetor blindfolded and put it back together better than it came, in a barn that leaks at the northeast corner when the wind comes from the wrong way, with his drawings and his spelling tests taped up all over the little office I framed out in the corner with leftover lumber. Now the Mustang. It came to me on a flatbed on a gray Tuesday in October, and the fellow who dropped it didn't know much, just had an address and a name on an invoice. Whitlock. A 67 fastback, dark green, and even sitting dead on that trailer with its hood up and a film of dust over everything, I'll tell you that car had a soul. You can feel it on some of them. Most cars are just appliances. A few of them are something more, and this was one of those. Somebody had loved this car once, loved it hard, and then somebody else had paid a fancy outfit $40,000 to bring it back to life, and that outfit had thrown up its hands. I know the shop. Not personally, but by reputation. The kind of place with a marble floor in the lobby and a guy in a polo who calls you my friend while he tells you your transmission's shot. They'd had the car 8 months. They'd done a lot of pretty work. I'll give them that. New paint, new chrome, an interior you could eat off of. But the thing wouldn't run right. It would catch, idle for a minute, then stumble and die. Catch, idle, die. And in the end, they'd written on the work order the magic words that let a shop walk away clean, something about the engine having intermittent internal fault inconsistent with cost-effective repair, which is a real expensive way of writing the words I don't know. The woman who owned it came to see it a few days after it landed in my barn. She didn't call ahead. She just showed up, and I heard the tires on my gravel before I saw her, and I came out wiping my hands on a rag, and there she was, stepping out of a car that probably cost more than my house, in a coat the color of fresh cream, looking at my barn and my burn barrel and my son's bike laid over in the yard the way a building inspector looks at a place he's about to condemn. Diane Whitlock. If you follow that world even a little, you might know the name. She built a software company out of nothing and sold a piece of it for a number with a lot of zeros, and from what I'd later pieced together, she ran her life the same way she ran that company, which is to say, she ran it like a closed fist. "You're the mechanic," she said. Not a question. She was looking at her phone the whole time, thumbing at something more important than my face. "Wesley Cooper," I said, and stuck out my hand. She looked at the hand the way you'd look at a wrench somebody handed you at a dinner party, and she didn't take it, and I let it drop, and I'll be honest, that one stung more than I let on. She walked past me into the barn like she owned it, which I suppose, given the car, she half did. She took one slow look around, at the leak stain in the northeast wall, at Caleb's drawings taped crooked all over the office glass, at the patch on my coveralls where my name stitched in red, and I watched her do the math on me and file me away in about a second and a half into the little drawer where people like her keep people like me. I've been filed away enough times in my life that I can feel the drawer slide shut now. It's a particular feeling, like a draft. "The restoration people tell me this car is essentially scrap," she said. "I've sunk an absurd amount into it already. My financial advisor thinks I'm sentimental and foolish, and he's correct on both counts. I'm told you take on lost causes." She finally looked up from the phone, just long enough to glance at me and then past me at Caleb, who'd come to the office doorway and was standing there reading her lips, the way he does, taking the whole of her in. "Does the boy work here too?" "That's my son," I said. "He helps me. He's got a better ear for an engine than I do." Which, the second it was out of my mouth, I heard how it sounded, and I waited for her to make something of it, and she didn't, because she'd already looked away, already lost interest in both of us. "Whatever," she said. "Look it over, tell me a number to make it run, or tell me to scrap it. I have very little patience for people who waste my time, Mr. Cooper, so do us both a favor, and be quick, and be honest." And then she left, just like that. Climbed back into her car and crunched off down my driveway, and Caleb came and stood next to me in the doorway and signed, real slow, so I wouldn't miss it. She's angry at something. Not us. Something else. He's a strange kid. Sees things. I told him to get back to his algebra and quit reading grown women like tea leaves, and he grinned at me and went. So I went to work on that Mustang, and I want to tell you how I did it, because it's the part that matters to me, even if it's the part the rest of the world always skips right over. I didn't plug it into a computer because a 67 doesn't have one, which is half of why I love them. I did it the slow way, the boring way, the way my father taught me, which is the only way that ever actually works, which is to say I sat with it. I listened to it try to run and die. I listened to it again and again. Caleb sat with me half of it, his hand flat on the fender, feeling the way the whole car shook through that catch and stumble, and he'd sign me what he felt, and I'd feel it too, and between the two of us we started to triangulate the thing. It wasn't the engine internals at all. Those fellas with the marble floor had gone chasing a ghost. The thing that kept catching and dying was fuel. The car was starving. It'd run on what was in the bowl and then it'd starve and quit. And so I went looking, slow and patient, the way you've got to. And I found it on the second afternoon, lying on a creeper under that car with a drop light in my teeth. A fuel line. One length of old rubber hose between the tank and the pump, and somebody, somewhere in that fancy 8-month restoration, had routed it a half-inch too close to the exhaust. And the heat off that exhaust, once the car warmed up, was softening the rubber just enough that it'd collapse, just slightly, just enough to choke the fuel down to a trickle, and the car would starve and die. And then it'd sit and cool, and the rubber would relax back open, and it'd run fine again, which is the whole and entire reason the fault was intermittent, which is the whole and entire reason a $40,000 shop chasing imaginary internal demons never once laid eyes on it, because the answer wasn't anywhere expensive. The answer was a $4 piece of fuel line and a man willing to lie under the car long enough to watch it happen. I replaced the hose with proper high temp line, and I rerouted it the way it should have been routed in the first place, away from the heat, and I clipped it down clean. Took me maybe 20 minutes, 15 of which was just getting my arm up in there. And then I drove that car. I didn't call it right off. I never do. I drove it 2 full days. I got it hot, sat in traffic with it on purpose down by the feed store, ran it till the gauge climbed, and it never so much as hiccuped, ran like a song, ran the way somebody's husband had clearly once known it could run, back before it ever needed any of us. Only then did I call the number on the invoice. She came back the next afternoon, and Caleb was home from school by then, sitting at the office desk, and she swept in the same as before, that cream coat, that chin, that phone, and I told her plain, a fuel line, $4 and change. I told her the restoration shop had been flat wrong, top to bottom, that there had never been one single thing wrong with the engine itself, that a soft hose run too close to the exhaust had been choking it the whole time, and that all $40,000 of their pretty work had walked right past a problem a paying customer could have found with patience and a drop light. And she laughed at me. Not a real one. A small, cold thing through the nose, the kind of laugh that's really a door swinging shut in your face. She told me, in that flat, even voice, that there was no possible way the certified master restorers she'd paid a fortune had missed something, a man in a leaking barn found with a flashlight in his teeth. She decided, right out loud, that I'd either reset something or gotten mucky, or was outright lying, and that the trouble would be back inside the week, and that she was not in the business of taking the word of A. And here she lifted one hand and waved it at my whole life, at the barn, at the leak, at the drawings, at me, over the word of professionals. Now, the smart and tired part of me wanted to just take the $80 I was going to charge her and watch her drive off and be done. But Caleb was sitting right there in the office doorway, 11 years old, watching this woman in the creamed coat look at his father like something stuck to her shoe. And he couldn't hear her words, but my boy doesn't need to hear a tone to read it. He reads faces better than anybody alive, and I watched him watch her, and something in me that doesn't usually get the wheel grabbed the wheel. "Diane," I said, "your car is fixed. I'll stake everything I've got on it. You drive it as hard and as long as you please, and it'll run perfect, because I found the actual trouble, which is more than your $40,000 shop ever managed." And that's the moment she made the bet. I think she meant it purely to put me back in my place. I think she was so deep down certain of herself, so used to being the smartest and the richest and the most important thing in any room she walked into, that she could not picture a world where the man in the barn was right and her experts were wrong. She fixed me with that cold little smile, loud enough that Caleb could read every word right off her lips. "All right, Mr. Cooper, a wager, since you're so confident. I'll drive this car for 1 month. 30 days, and if your $4 miracle holds, if nothing at all goes wrong, I'll sign over the Roadster sitting in my garage to you. It's brand new. It's worth more than this property and everything standing on it, very much including the two of you. And when it fails, you'll refund every cent. And you'll hang a sign in that barn that says you are not fit to touch a real automobile. Do we have a deal? It was a cruel thing, and I want you to understand it was built to be cruel. It was engineered to make me back down, to make me stammer and hedge and admit I wasn't really sure, to shove the small man back into his small place. In her head, that Roadster was never once at risk. It was a prop, a stage light, a thing she could wave around precisely because she could not imagine, even for a second, losing it to a man like me. But I'd just spent 2 days under that Mustang. I knew exactly what I'd found. I knew that soft little hose was the beginning, the middle, and the end of the whole story. And I had a deaf 11-year-old sitting behind me in a doorway with a closing window, and a number on it I couldn't begin to reach. So I looked Diane Whitlock dead in the eye, and I put out my hand again, and this time she took it, and I said, "Deal." She drove off in a flawless Mustang, dead certain she'd just laid a clever trap for a fool. That was a long month. I'll be honest with you, not because I had a flicker of doubt about the car, I didn't, not for 1 second. It was a long month because Caleb had a hard stretch right in the middle of it. There's a frustration that builds in him sometimes, when the hearing world won't slow down for him, when a teacher won't repeat herself, when the other kids stop trying, and it had been bad. He came home one day and signed almost nothing and went straight to the barn and put his hand on the cold engine block of a truck I was working on and just left it there. And I understood, because there are days I want to do the exact same thing. And that was the night, sitting on the workbench next to my boy in the dark, that I let myself think about that Roadster for the first time. Not as a toy, not as some rich woman's prop, as a number, as my son's ear, as the whole wide world cracking open a little further for him. The Mustang ran perfect, all 31 days of it, not one stumble, not one stall, not one cough, because a correctly diagnosed, correctly installed $4 fuel line is every single thing that car had ever actually needed. And here's where Diane Whitlock surprised me the first time, because plenty of people like her, when they lose a bet they were sure they'd win, they just don't pay. They lawyer up. They stall. They make you go away. I'd have figured I'd never hear from her again. Instead, 1 month to the day she pulled up my gravel, and she was quiet. None of the razor in her voice. She walked into the barn and set a set of keys on my workbench, and beside them the signed title, all in order. "It runs perfectly," she said, and the words came out of her stiff, like they cost her something on the way past. I had it looked at, twice, by people I trust. They confirmed it. Your diagnosis was correct. That last word came out of her like a splinter. And then I did the thing she did not see coming. I didn't whoop, I didn't crow. I'd spent a month being treated like dirt, and I didn't gloat, not 1 inch. I just picked up the keys and the title, and I said, "Quiet. Thank you. I'm going to sell it." Something moved across her face. She actually looked, for the first time, at me. "You're going to sell it," she said. "You want a Roadster, and you're going to sell it. Do you have any idea what that car—" And then she stopped, cold, mid-sentence, because she'd quit looking at me and started looking past my shoulder, at the office glass, at Caleb's drawings. And taped right in the middle of them was one I've never been able to bring myself to take down. A crayon drawing of a boy with 2 big swirls of color over his ears, and a tall stick-figure man next to him with a wrench in one hand, and over the top of it, in my son's careful, blocky letters, the kind a kid makes when writing is hard and he wants it perfect anyway, "M.E. and Dad" against the Q yet. Diane Whitlock went very still. "Whose drawing is that?" she said, and there was no blade left in it at all. And I don't fully know why I told her. Maybe I was just tired all the way to the bone. Maybe a month of sitting up nights doing math that never works will strip the pride right off a man until there's nothing left to hand somebody but the truth. But I told her all of it. About Caleb, about the quiet he's lived in his whole life, and the window that was closing, and the surgery that would crack the world open for him, and the number on it, and the mother who stood at the start of that long, hard road and found she couldn't walk it. And I told her why a man takes a cruel stranger's bet without blinking, because that roadster she'd been so sure she'd never lose, to me from the first second, was never a trophy. It was an ear. It was my boy's whole shot at hearing his own name called out loud. The quiet that filled my barn then was the loudest thing I have ever stood inside of. The woman who an hour before had looked at my son and me like furniture, who'd built a whole bed out of nothing but to grind me down in front of my own kid, stood there in the middle of my leaking barn and put one hand flat over her mouth, and her eyes filled and went over. And all that armor I'd been so sure went clear to the bone turned out to be a shell after all. Just a hard shell with a scared person folded up small somewhere down inside it. Because here's the thing about Diane Whitlock I didn't know that day. The thing I'd only learned slow, in pieces, over the long stretch of months that came after. She grew up with nothing. Less than nothing. The kind of childhood, so cold and so frightening and so unsafe, that she'd built that armor onto herself on purpose. One plate at a time, swearing some furious kid's oath that she would never ever be powerless or poor or looked through again as long as she drew breath. And somewhere across 20 hard years of keeping that oath, she'd turned, without ever once meaning to, into the very thing that had hurt her in the first place. She'd spent 2 decades proving she was the smartest and the richest and the most untouchable thing in every room, and she'd never stopped once to count what it cost the people she looked straight through. And here, standing in front of her, was a man who had nothing she'd ever wanted. A leaking roof, a box of $4 parts, a second-hand creeper, and a boy who couldn't hear and who somehow, impossibly, had the one thing she'd been hunting for 20 years and never once found. A kid who drew pictures of his old man as a hero and taped them where he'd see them every single day. The Mustang, it turned out, had been her husband's. She told me that part later, much later. He'd died 4 years back. Sudden, the kind of sudden that doesn't give you a chance to say anything you meant to. And that green 67 was the one thing of his she'd never been able to let go of, and she'd poured $40,000 into a fancy shop trying to bring it back to life. And what she'd really been trying to do, I think, was bring something back to life that no shop on earth could touch. And a man in a barn with a $4 hose had done the one thing all her money couldn't. He'd made the thing run again. She didn't say much else that day. She left quiet, which I'd come to understand wasn't like her, but she came back. The next week, and the week after that. At first I figured it was guilt, and I damn near told her to keep her pity, that the Coopers weren't a charity and we weren't for sale, but it wasn't pity. She'd used those connections of hers, quietly, without a word to me until it was done, to get Caleb's file in front of one of the best pediatric surgeons in the country. Up at a hospital in Philadelphia, I could never have gotten him within a mile of on my own, and she'd been careful, almost fierce about it, not to just write a check. Because somehow she already understood that I'd never in 100 years take a handout. She did the one thing all that money could do that wasn't an insult. She opened a door I could never have opened, and she let me walk my own son through it. And then she just kept showing up. She'd come by late afternoons after Caleb was off the bus, and at first he was shy of her, this tall, fancy lady who smelled like money. And then Caleb, who has never met a stranger he stayed shy of past about 4 minutes, started teaching her to sign. Slow at first, the alphabet, then his name. Then, because he is who he is, every swear word he knew, which I had to put a stop to. And one afternoon I came out of the bay wiping grease off my hands and stopped dead. Because there was Diane Whitlock, worth more money than my whole county, sitting on an upturned bucket in my leaking barn in a skirt that cost more than my truck, signing letters back to an 11-year-old, getting half of them wrong, laughing at herself when he corrected her, and not minding it one bit. I'll tell you the truest part of this whole thing as careful as I know how, because I don't want to cheapen it by rushing. I didn't fall for Diane because she was rich. God knows I'd just spent 2 months getting looked down on by everything her money had slowly turned her into. And she didn't fall for me because I was some noble salt of the earth poor man either. She'd have been disgusted by that, and so would I. What actually happened between us was slower than that, and a whole lot realer. She kept coming back because for the first time in her armored-up adult life, she'd walked into 2 people who didn't want a single thing from her, not the money, not the name, not the connections. 2 people who just let her sit on a bucket in a dirty barn and be, for an hour, an actual human being. And I let her in slow, 1 careful inch at a time. because I stood there week after week and watched a hard, cold, frightened woman thaw out into a warm one right in front of me. And because my son, who is without exaggeration the shrewdest judge of a human heart I have ever personally known, looked that woman over real careful and decided all on his own that he trusted her. The surgery happened that spring, up in Philadelphia, and Caleb came through it. I'm going to say that again, slow, because there are still mornings I wake up and can't believe I get to. My son came through his surgery, and a few weeks after, in the audiologist's office, when they switched the thing on and tuned it, I watched my boy's face do something I will be seeing behind my eyes on the day I die. He heard my voice, both sides, for the first time in his whole life. The world came at him in stereo, and he looked at me, and he didn't have a sign for it, and he didn't need one. The money from the Roadster, because yes, I sold it, exactly like I told her I would. That money paid for the 100 things insurance dug in and fought us on. The travel, the therapy after, the plain, unfamiliar breathing room a man like me never once in his life gets to feel. And Diane was right there in that waiting room with me the whole long day of the surgery. Not as anything official yet, we hadn't put words on it, just as a person who plainly could not have been anywhere else on this earth. She held my hand through the worst hours of my life, and she didn't fill them up with talk. Didn't hand me one easy, comfortable lie, because by then she'd finally learned the thing all her money never taught her. That just showing up and staying and being quiet next to somebody in the dark is worth more than anything a person can buy. We got married a little over a year later, small, at the barn of all places, with the roof finally fixed, because that turned out to be her one hard line, that she'd be allowed to pay to fix that leak, and after everything, I figured I could let her have that one. Caleb stood up front and held the rings, and he signed the whole ceremony to himself under his breath. Every word, because he could, because now he had every word. And the woman who'd once looked at my boy like an inconvenience became his mother, not a replacement for the one who left. Caleb and I are careful with each other about that, always have been. But a mom, a real one, the kind who shows up and stays, which is the only kind that ever counted for a thing. Here's what I turn over late at night more than any other part of it. Diane had every single thing money could buy, and she was the loneliest, hardest, most walled-off person I'd ever met. And the thing that finally got through to her, after 20 years, it wasn't a grand gesture, and it wasn't a bigger fortune, and it wasn't anything that could be bought or sold at all. It was a kid's crayon drawing taped to a leaking wall and a tired man who took a cruel bet for the only reason worth taking one. She told me once, a long while after, lying awake, that the day she drove up my gravel fully expecting to feel like a loser handing over those keys, and instead found out what I meant to do with that car and why. That was the first day in 30 years she could remember who she'd been before the armor, a scared kid with nothing in her pockets who only ever wanted one single thing in all the world, for somebody, anybody, to show up for her and stay. And in the end, she got to be exactly that, somebody, for my Caleb, and I am as sure as I'm sure of anything that had healed something down in her, that all the money on God's earth had never once been able to reach. I still roll up that barn door every morning. I'll never be a rich man myself, and marrying one changed precisely nothing about the way I work, because I still find the $4 hose instead of selling some frightened soul an engine they don't need. That's just who I am, and my boy's always watching how his dad does a thing. There's a version of this where I let that cruel bet turn me bitter, where I snatched up that Roadster and gloated in her face and roared off down the road feeling like I'd finally won something. And there's just no version of that story where my son ends up with a mother and a hard, frightened woman gets her own buried heart handed back to her, and I end up with somebody who holds my hand without a word in a hospital waiting room. I'm so glad I was too tired that day to gloat. I'm so glad I just told the plain truth about a crayon drawing instead. So, let me ask you one thing before you go. A woman drove up my driveway and looked at me and my boy like the two of us were nothing at all. And under every last plate of that armor, it turned out, was a scared kid who'd just plain forgotten how to let another living soul show up for her. And I've been wondering ever since how many of the hardest, coldest, most difficult people we're all so quick to write off in a glance are really only somebody who got hurt so bad, so young, that they built a wall and then forgot there'd ever been a door in it. Have you ever watched somebody you'd completely written off turn out to be something else entirely once something finally cracked the shell? Or have you ever been that person yourself? Tell me down in the comments. I read every one of them, and I'd truly like to know. I think about that gray Tuesday more than I let on. The flatbed in my driveway, the dead green Mustang, a woman in a cream coat who couldn't see two human beings standing right in front of her. And I've come to believe that nothing in this whole story happened by accident. Every piece of it was the plain working out of choices, mine and Diane's both, stretched across a year. Diane Whitlock got what her choices built. 20 years of treating people like furniture had earned her a life with money in every corner of it, and not one soul who'd sit with her in the dark. That's not a punishment somebody handed down on her. That's just the harvest of seeds she planted, one cold day at a time. And the morning she chose, finally, to tell the truth about being scared, to fix a leaking roof instead of grinding a man down, the harvest changed too. Cause and effect. It runs as clean and as honest through a human heart as it does through a fuel line. I didn't beat Diane with a bigger fortune, because I'll never have one. I beat that broken Mustang with patience, and I won that woman's whole buried heart with 3 plain things that don't cost $1. The first is just doing right when nobody's making you. I could have sold her an engine she didn't need, same as that fancy shop tried to. I didn't, because Caleb is always watching how his dad does a thing, and a boy learns what a man is by what the man does, when the bill could have been bigger. The second is the slow, stubborn kind of smart that has nothing to do with diplomas. Those $40,000 experts chased a ghost. I lay under that car on my back until I saw the truth with my own 2 eyes. Because looking close and refusing to guess is its own kind of intelligence, the only kind I've ever trusted. And the third is the plain grit to keep showing up. Through the nights the math wouldn't work. Through the hard stretch when Caleb went quiet and put his hand on a cold engine block because the hearing world wouldn't slow down for him. You don't quit. You roll the door up the next morning and you go again. If you take one thing from Caleb and me, let it be that. Be honest when a lie would pay better. Look closer when everyone else has already given up and gone home. And keep your feet moving through the dark stretch, because the dark stretch is exactly where most folks turn back. Those 3 things turned a $4 hose into my son hearing his own name for the first time in his life. They turned the coldest woman I ever met into the mother who held my hand in a waiting room. None of it was luck. It was just plain truth, planted careful and watered every single day, finally coming up green. That's the whole of it. A scared kid behind every wall, and a door in every wall if you've got the patience to find it.